Welcome back to OTR. Our guest Rachelle Crow-Hercher is leading a petition drive to tax the rich to pay for schools. Our lead story, GM reinvesting billions back into Michigan. On the OTR panel, Simon Schuster, Lauren Gibbons, Jonathan Oosting, and guest anchor Chuck Stokes. Sit in with the panel as they get inside out, off the record.
Production of Off the Record is made possible in part by Bellwether Public Relations, a full-service strategic communications agency partnering with clients through public relations, digital marketing, and issue advocacy. Learn more at bellwetherpr.com. And now, this edition of Off the Record with Tim Skubic.
And welcome to Off the Record. I'm Chuck Stokes filling in for Tim Skubic. Another busy news week in the state of Michigan, led by General Motors and the automotive industry, and then, of course, continued debate in the legislature, this time particularly on the House side over the education budget and back and forth on that. So let's start with GM. Jonathan, $4 billion shifting from Mexico back into the United States. Is that good news?
Yeah, I mean, it's more investment in Michigan, specifically the Orion Township plant is going to get some more money to shift. It is celebrated news for supporters of President Donald Trump, who suggests this is evidence that his tariffs are working to encourage, onshoring of production. But it also signals a really big shift in EVs. I mean, the Orion Township plant, let's go back 3 years. 3 years ago, Governor Gretchen Whitmer joined GM to announce a huge $7 billion investment to retool Orion Township for EV production and to invest in an electric battery plant here in the Lansing area. 3 years later, neither of those are actually happening. Orion Township is now going to be producing gas-powered trucks, SUVs, and GM already divested of its interest in the battery plant and sold its shares to LG. So it's a radical shift and an acknowledgement. The CFO of the company acknowledged, yeah, tariffs were a factor, but also just lower demand for EVs than anticipated.
Yeah, to me, this is just a sign of the times in the Trump administration. Certainly tariffs, no sign of them going away anytime soon. And as Jonathan just mentioned, EVs, there's been a significant shift away from them after the buildup of so many years. And it just, demand hasn't been there. And also some of these incentives that were in place during the Biden administration are also looking like they're on the way out because Trump isn't a huge fan of those. So it is certainly big news for Michigan. I think always officials are always glad to see investment in the state, but also, just looking at what this investment is does signal industry is watching what's happening and making some big shifts.
And of course, you mentioned the big picture. What's the eventuality in terms of EV? Overnight, Congressman John James got the president to sign legislation to be able to block what California wants to do in terms of moving and shifting everything into EVs. So certainly I would think he would consider that's a win for him. But are we really giving the store away to China, Simon?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting because where you look at where Governor Gretchen Whitmer has invested political capital in terms of her economic agenda over the past few years, it's been in trying to bring that electric vehicle supply chain to Michigan. When you look at Goshen, when you look at the Ultium battery plant, and also the Ford's venture in Marshall, Michigan, all of these are sort of either downscaling or mired in litigation. And so it's going to be difficult to sort of reverse that path dependency. When you look at the electric vehicle transition, Europe, Asia, they're all moving ahead of the United States. And I think that we're sort of developing a lag in that transition, in part due to protectionist trade policies. We can't get Chinese EVs here, and right now you have companies like BYD in China who are building factories that could put out 1 million vehicles a year, selling these vehicles at a loss through state subsidies. And so when you look at where the competitive stance of Asia is, it's becoming an increasingly difficult marketplace for North American automakers to break into.
All right, let's talk about what happened in Lansing this past week. Back in April, Democrats in the Senate passed their education budget. Now we see the Republicans have their plan passed by, I think, just 3 votes. But there's a lot of debate, and all of this is supposed to be done by July 1st. What's the chance of that happening, and how much friction is there going to be between the House's plan and the Senate's plan?
There's going to be a lot of friction. I guess never say never on this July thing. It's always the goal of lawmakers to get it done before school starts.
Because that's when superintendents would love to be able to have that so they can make their plans.
Yes. So their budget schedule is a little different than the state's budget schedule. They constitutionally have to be done by October. October 1st is the final day. Technically, there's a state law that they want to push it to the summertime to make it easier for schools and local governments to plan. But these plans are very, very different right now, and it doesn't sound like there's a lot of people seeing eye to eye. The House plan, made some pretty significant cuts. It has requirements for gender-neutral bathrooms. There's a lot going on in there that was not in the Senate budget and that Senate Democrats are not big fans of. So I think there's a lot of room in between these budgets that would need to be negotiated still.
I think it was Senator Camilleri said we couldn't be farther apart now that we've seen what the House budget is. So these are radical shifts. I mean, obviously there's big attention-grabbing stuff in the House Republican bill, like as Lauren mentioned, penalties for schools that have transgender-friendly bathrooms or sports teams, stuff like that. But then there's also
diversity, equity, or inclusion, you'll be penalized for that.
Yep, but there's also just a radical shift in how programs would be funded. The House plan essentially gets rid of all these, they're called categoricals, like specific buckets for funding, and instead puts them all into the foundation allowance and says schools can have the money and decide how to spend it. But, the fear is that if there's not devoted money for free lunches and breakfasts, that schools are going to, maybe not do that universally. So these are big programs that Democrats specifically have built into the budgets in recent years and touted. Governor Whitmer, the free lunch and breakfast is like one of her marquee education proposals. The House would do away with that. I mean, it would give schools more money, actually, and the foundation allowance to do as they wish with, but it wouldn't require some of these programs that Democrats have really sought to fund in recent years.
Yeah. Simon, all the Democrats voted against it. Almost all the Republicans voted for it, but 2 Republicans didn't. What was that all about?
Right, and I think this sort of echoes what we saw under the Democratic trifecta a bit. When you look at the sea changes of policy that are proposed in this education budget, this is Republicans effectively staking out a position, a statement of purpose that's counter to what Democrats want to do. But at the same time, they have a relatively narrow majority in the House, about 58 votes, and they need basically all of those votes on board in order to get this legislation passed. Now, the House was in session for more than 10 hours yesterday as they were trying to cobble together this majority to get this legislation passed. They were eventually able to get there, but only by reversing some of these higher education funding cuts that we saw, specifically in the higher education portion of the budget, I should say. I mean, if you rewind a bit back to, let's say, 2011 and Rick Snyder's first year in office, amid a budgetary shortfall, there was a 10% funding cut to higher education, to Michigan's universities. And this was something that you heard echoed and discussed for years afterwards in terms of like the belt tightening that it required at these institutions. Right now they're proposing a 65% decrease in state funding to the University of Michigan. So when this shakes out, as it passes the legislature, will we see a budget cut that dramatic? I'm very skeptical of that, of course, especially with Democrats in control of the Senate.
Where do you see an area of compromise, or do you think that, like you said, they're a mile apart, one end versus the other end. They've got to come to the center. Hopefully they got to come to the center, but they may not. What areas?
It is important to reiterate that these are value statements from both the Democrats and Republicans. There is likely going to be somewhere in the middle. Some of these things in question have been bipartisan in the past. I think where you might find a little more friction are some of these things. The House Republicans have a lot of value statements emblematic of what the Trump administration is doing, like DEI and anti-trans initiatives. Democrats have been very against that. So some of those social issues will probably be sticking points. But, when it comes to a sea change in how schools are funded, for example, I think you could probably see some Republicans being a little more comfortable with past precedent. But that said, a lot remains to be seen. A lot of negotiations need to happen.
And these are also just the education budgets. I mean, the interesting thing about the House K-12 plan, for instance, is that it actually spends more money than Democrats had proposed, not less. It's not huge cuts. It just has these penalties built in. But I think that's the reason you saw a couple conservatives maybe peel off, because it's still a pretty big budget bill. The question is, what other areas of the budget are Republicans going to try and target? Because they've also got this $3 billion road funding plan that they've unveiled, but haven't said exactly how that would be funded. So there's a lot of questions left, a lot of moving parts. I mean, the fact that this budget is coming out almost in mid-June is pretty late already to even propose one. So I am very, very skeptical they'll get to an agreement by July 30. But as Lauren mentioned, constitutionally, the real deadline is October 1 when the new fiscal year starts. If they're not there, we could be looking at the first government shutdown, even hours, as it were, in the mid-2000s.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Simon.
Yeah, I think that there's a pretty complicated political calculus at play here for Republicans. On one hand, as Jonathan pointed out, they are looking to increase that foundational allowance, the per pupil funding that they're giving, relative to Democrats. Because I think that their fear is that if they're going to cut all of these social programs about, if they want to require, $100 fines if you include your pronouns in a school email, that then they can't also, cut these pure people foundation allowance, because this is something that Democrats are going to use as an election talking point and make hay with, saying that Republicans want to disinvest in education. But at the same time, they have this majority that they need to cobble together that still has a number of fiscal conservatives in it who really value the notion of cutting down the size of government, that government should play less of a role and that we should have a larger role for charter and private schools. So I think you see that in terms of the funding shifts, looking to move money from higher educational institutions towards a scholarship program, which then could direct that money towards private universities. And so, trying to balance all that out, you can see sort of the trouble that caused them last night.
Is this dissension, Jonathan, going to lead to more ballot issues? Turn it over to the people to a great extent?
Well, I mean, ballot issues take so long to get off the ground that I don't think what we're seeing this year is necessarily going to lead to that. But yeah, I think we might see a lot of ballot issues this year. We tend to, we tend to in Michigan every few years. Especially when there are big statewide races on the ballots, different groups want to get in front of voters with their issues, and we're seeing a fair amount of that. Obviously, our guest today is with one of those groups, but Simon has written about the prospect of a constitutional convention that's going to be on the ballot automatically. There's groups trying to reform election law so that with stronger safeguards to ensure non-citizens can't vote. There is potentially, rumblings of a attempt to remove the state's same-sex marriage ban that's dormant but still on the books technically. So we might see a lot on the ballot this year.
What are you all hearing in terms of Governor Whitmer and where she is on all of this? Is she forcefully involved in these negotiations, or is she just sitting back, letting her leaders in the House and Senate work all this out before she steps in?
In terms of the budget, she has, I think, been involved, but hasn't said much publicly. I think, kind of waiting.
Yeah, I think that one of the difficulties that we've had here is that because so little legislation has been produced by this legislature and signed by Governor Whitmer, there haven't been a lot of examples of these government leaders getting together and coordinating and negotiating together. So as we move forward in the budgetary process, it's going to be interesting to see, without a lot of reps put in terms of getting these negotiations to happen.
All right, well, we're going to get some grassroots opinions on all this with our guest, Rachelle Crow-Hercher, and she is with the Michigan Education Justice Coalition. Welcome to Off the Record.
Thank you for having me.
Good, very good. All right, who wants to take first question? Lauren?
Sure. Yeah, well, tell us a little bit about the proposal that you've put together. Why is this the right path forward for funding education?
Well, our proposal is a fair share surcharge on the wealthiest Michiganders. It would be a 5% increase in the marginal rate for individual filers over $500,000 a year and joint filers over $1 million a year. And I think that this is the right route to go because as we see in the budget negotiations, there's a lot of times when education is sort of on the back burner of a priority for folks. So by constitutionally amending and requiring these funds to go to the school aid fund, we are saying that this is our value statement. This is where we believe every child in Michigan deserves a quality, adequately funded education. So it's a value statement, and it also is a little bit of a preventative for negotiations or removing those funds later on if this was to go through the legislature. But then in addition, because we're changing the tax structure, that has to go through the constitutional route.
Aren't you afraid that people will look out there and say, you're just taxing the wealthy?
Well, that's exactly what I'm doing.
Yeah,
so that's okay.
But don't you fear that there may be a backlash for that?
That's not what I'm hearing on the ground. Quite frankly, there are times when I'm discussing this with folks who, folks might assume are politically opposed to that kind of thing. And the first line of let's tax the rich is what brings them in. They don't care what it's for, but they are enthused over the idea of taxing the rich across the state. So
Rachelle,
I'm not afraid of that fight.
On that question, Rachelle, have you guys focus grouped or polled that specific phrase, tax the rich? I can imagine that on billboards.
We have, yes.
And?
It polls very well.
Why do you think that is?
I think that we are in a time politically where folks are not seeing our representatives on either side of the aisle understand and value what working class and middle class Americans are going through. And we all see that, that those values of community are not reflected, and that the wealthy are buying elections. They are rating things or attempting to rate things at the federal level in order to give billionaires more tax cuts. There's a movement of working class and middle class folks who understand that they are not getting the fair end of this deal.
Sure. But Rachelle, critics are already saying this, I'm sure you're prepared for this, that money does not solve educational problems alone. We have seen the governor and the legislature in recent years, every year, touting record funding for K-12 education, and yet our test scores are some of the worst in the nation. They're not necessarily improving. What is money actually going to solve here?
Well, first of all, I agree. I think it's a both-and situation. Money is not going to fix all of the problems, but Michigan has disinvested itself from education. Whether we're spending, record amounts of money, which we hear on both sides of the aisle, we are spending records amount of money in terms of total dollars. But when we adjust for inflation, we're not spending a record amount of money. And so that's reflected in our test scores and the achievements of our kids over the past decade and a half of disinvestment in education in Michigan. Michigan is 49th out of 50th in growth of education funding since 2012.
Are there safeguards in this proposal, though, that ensures the money just doesn't go to more administrators and actually gets into the classroom?
It is subject to audit. That is in the language. So for sure, there are some safeguards that are built into it. And, we are out there all the time advocating for what parents and students are telling us they want to be funded. So our top priorities are going to be career and technical education, reducing class sizes, and attracting and retaining high quality teachers.
You also want students to be involved in this from almost a grassroots level. You want them on local boards. You want them with the Michigan State Board. That's going to be a drastic sea change.
It is a drastic sea change, but I can say this. We model this at the Michigan Education Justice Coalition. We are a coalition of community orgs that have parents, students, educators, and board members at the table. So we are very much so a model of involving and including youth voice in our policy recommendations. And I think that it's entirely possible that we continue to listen to what students say they need in their classrooms.
Simon?
Now, Rachelle, Michigan has had a flat income tax for a really long time, and this would sort of provide some of the structural change that advocates like yourself have been talking about for decades. If you open that door in the Constitution, as you're hoping to do, raise taxes on folks making over $500,000 a year, I can envision criticism saying that this is going to open the door, that then that tax increase is going to descend through lower income levels. Do you have any safeguards in the ballot proposal that shows that this is not going to sort of descend down into middle incomes or even poor folks in terms of a tax increase?
Well, this is a very specific 5% surcharge on the wealthiest of earners. Any other change to the tax structure would have to go through a similar ballot proposal initiative because of the limitations of the state constitution. So if voters say that that's what they want to do, then that's what voters say they want to do. I have no control over, after ours goes through, or hopefully goes through, what voters vote for in the future.
Yeah, at the same time, next election, we're going to have, as Jonathan pointed out, a constitutional convention question on the ballot as well. Are you going to tell your supporters to vote against this, given that it could place the amendment you're trying to make potentially at risk?
I think that I'm going to continue to be neutral on that right now until I know more about what is coalescing on the ground for a proposal of a constitutional convention. What are folks saying they want to do?
I guess I'm curious, is there anything in the initiative, or is your group supportive of any particular plan on how to disperse the funds regionally? Usually if a local millage to raise funds for schools comes forward, people can at least be assured that the money is going back to their community. Is there any plan for how different regions might get some of this funding if this were to pass?
I mean, this goes through the school aid fund, so it's the same mechanism of control that exists now, which is we have to go and talk to our representatives and tell them what our priorities are from year to year, which I think is the beauty of it. There is not a year that goes by that we don't have hundreds of community members go to Lansing and talk with their representatives about what they prioritize for the education budget. And I think that's a beautiful mechanism of democracy, is that we do have a say because we elect the folks that distribute those funds, and then we get to go and talk to them and tell them what we want to see.
Rachelle, I think I read that you guys anticipate this will generate about $1.7 billion a year for education. How'd you arrive at that, and how'd you arrive at the $500,000 or $1 million per couple threshold for this 5%? I'm going to call it a tax. You can call it a surcharge. I'm going to call it a tax.
Well, how we arrived at the 5% number is through polling and focus groups. How we calculated what it would generate is all the smart economists who are math nerds and much better at that kind of thing than I am.
Fair enough.
Part of this proposal, you want to get to the emotional changes that you would like to see take place in education. It's not just funding, this is also in terms of policy. How big of a problem is that for this generation of students?
There's not a day goes by that I don't talk to a young person that isn't frustrated with their situation in their schools, with a situation in their schools. And I hear from students from across the state, rural students in the Sioux and the western region of the UP, to students in Grand Rapids, to students in Pontiac and Detroit. I myself live in Utica Community Schools. There is not a day goes by that I don't hear from students and parents about their priorities not being reflected either in their local education budgets with their school board or at the state level.
How are you going to get, you have to get what, 600,000 signatures? How do you plan to get it, and how are you going to pay for them? Or are you?
How we're going to get it is we have a plan, and we have a lot of volunteers in place to get in the streets and talk to Michiganders about education funding. We are not paying for signature collection on our end at the Michigan Education Justice Coalition, but we are dedicating a fair amount of our staff time and our volunteer time to getting in our sneakers and canvassing and attending all the summer events to collect those signatures.
When you say you're not paying for signatures, does that mean your group specifically or the whole coalition?
My group specifically, and I can identify that most of our coalition members have no plan at this time to pay for paid signature collectors.
Are you saving your money then for a ballot campaign? I mean, if it makes the ballot, I don't know if you've heard, but rich people have a lot of money, and they might want to spend to defeat this proposal.
Not only are we saving our money, but I argue all the time that grassroots is the way to go. And I want to make sure that as we're collecting signatures, we're having conversations with Michiganders across the state about this issue.
So you're going to, obviously, the thrust of this ballot proposal is to raise more money for schools. But what sort of outcomes can you point to? What can you say that, if we raise this more money, this is what's going to happen?
I mean, there's plenty of established scholarship in the idea that money matters. We actually distributed a one-pager of research that points to money actually does lead to better outcomes, whether it's smaller class sizes that allow teachers to focus more on kids, to give them more differentiated instruction, to give them more one-on-one time, to better facilities, to having full bellies with breakfast and lunch programs. Those all lead to better outcomes for students. The evidence is settled in that matter. So having the discussion that we can just fix this through policy alone and not raising revenue, I think is disingenuous.
All right. Ms. Crow-Hercher, thank you so much for joining us. And will you stay in touch with us on this as you roll it all out?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
All right. We look forward to getting you back on Off the Record down the line. And panel, we want to thank you for joining us today on Off the Record. We want to thank you at home for joining us. And happy Father's Day to all the fathers out there. I'm Chuck Stokes filling in for Tim Skubic. Good day.
Production of Off the Record is made possible in part by Bellwether Public Relations, a full-service strategic communications agency partnering with clients through public relations, digital marketing, and issue advocacy. Learn more at bellwetherpr.com. For more Off the Record, visit WKAR.org. Michigan public television stations have contributed to the production costs of Off the Record.